Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Annette Bourne, Associate Fellow with the Russia-Eurasia Program at Chatham House, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Thank you for joining our event today. We have with us Bradley Jardine and Edward Lemon, and we'll be talking about China's emergence as a key actor in Central Asia and the repercussions for the region's relations with other global powers. Bradley is a political risk analyst and the managing director of the Oxford Society of Central Asian Affairs, and Edward is a research assistant professor at Texas A&M University in Washington, D.C., and he's also the president of the Oxford Society. Edward and Bradley have just published a book looking at Beijing's role and ambitions in Central Asia, and not least how its actions are perceived there. It draws on over a decade of research and fieldwork throughout even the most remotest corners of Central Asia, as well as on an original data set tracking protests in the region. The book is called Backlash, China's Struggle for Influence in Central Asia. And we've put a link in the chat should you wish to purchase it. Now, we'll begin with two relatively short presentations from our two speakers, and I'll follow this with a moderated discussion before taking questions from our audience. Please do enter your questions using the Q&A function. Today's session is on the record and recorded on Chatham House's Zoom platform, and we'll have a post-event video on the Chatham House event page in a few days' time. So a very warm welcome to both of you. Bradley, let's start with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting us both to share our work with you today. As you've mentioned, we've been working on this book for the best part of a decade. It really started with, obviously seeing China's emergence as an actor, both in terms of its economic role, displacing Russia as the region's primary economic partner, but also its emergence more recently as a security actor. The book kind of largely draws from our project from 2020, which was the Central Asia Protest Tracker. We're really trying to expand discourse. A lot of folks, they talk about great power competition. They often miss regions with smaller state actors like the governments of Central Asia in these conversations and how they have their own agency, how they interact with great powers. We wanted to take that conversation a step further and bring in not just local governments, but looking at the agency of local activists, local communities, looking at public opinion, the role of individuals who mobilize against projects, often infrastructure projects that China wants to promote in the region. And I think that this was an interesting dynamic because these were voices that were often left out of the conversation. And also for Central Asia being an authoritarian, top-down political systems, there's often not really much focus on the importance of the wider public and how they fit within decision making, how they put limits on government policy, and oftentimes force about turns on some policy as well. So that was the dynamics that we really hope to capture with this book. So it's a story about China's emergence in the region. And as we say, it's, as with the theme of this conversation, how China's shaping Central Asia. But also, we want to kind of posit the idea that Central Asia is also shaping the way that China engages with the world. And that's why Central Asia is so important as a case study, is that oftentimes China chooses to showcase or experiment with policies in Central Asia first. As a contiguous region, it's central to a lot of China's more recent global initiatives. Of course, the Belt and Road Initiative is the most prominent of these. We think about the logistical corridors linking China with Europe and the rest of Eurasia. They start in Central Asia, and they were announced in Kazakhstan for good reason. That's symbolically very important. So Central Asia's role in China's vision of global security, global trade is very important. And so what China rolls out in the region, the type of opposition it might face, or the buy-in it gets from local governments, this kind of informs how it approaches other regions, Latin America, Africa, where China is active. So I think that that's important. That's why Central Asia is particularly interesting. So in terms of Central Asia itself, of course, we can extrapolate some of the trends and patterns of China's engagement in the region. We can look at and compare with other regions, but there are some unique elements in China's engagement with Central Asia. we start the book off by kind of exploring what China's interests in the region are. And of course, unlike other actors, China has relations with Central Asia spanning millennia. It has a long, deep historic interaction, civilizational contact points with the region. And so we also have another chapter exploring the history of this deep engagement, the fractured relations when it comes to border territoriality. But in terms of summarizing China's core interests, of course, one of the regions, China's westernmost province of Xinjiang, where there has been mass crackdowns in recent years, attempts to control the local Uyghur population, and a long-standing fixation on the idea of separatism, or the idea that ethnic minority predominant regions will separate from China. Central Asia is very important because it's a region that shares a lot of similarities with the peoples of Xinjiang and even ethnic kin groups. There's large Kazakh minorities in Xinjiang, for example. So that security aspect is very important, the way that China engages with Central Asia to pacify any potential for unrest or political movements taking shape in Central Asia and interacting and influencing the politics of Xinjiang. Of course, autocratic stability. China favors these kind of political systems. It's easier to deal through local elites. And that's also what we bring up in this book, that China's reliance on local elites often leaves it exposed to wide criticism from wider publics, or it's not put much effort into soft power and influencing the broader public. And that's often been a disadvantage to China's global policies, and we'll talk about that a lot more in the discussion. Of course, energy security. China is very concerned with the prospect of a conflict in the Asia Pacific and reliance on energy supplies coming through those shipping routes. And of course, the Malacca dilemma, this being a crucial choke point in the event of some global war, is always a talking point in China and Beijing. And so Central Asia helps mitigate some of that by having Eurasian land corridors, alternative energy supply routes. Central Asia is a very energy-rich region. And of course, increasingly, there's a lot more focus on critical minerals as well as part of global technology supply chains. The region is not only rich in traditional hydrocarbons, it's also rich in critical minerals. And that's informed a lot of Washington's recent engagement of the region, so not only China's. And of course, as we've discussed, transit routes and corridors, the Belt and Road, and other major economic initiatives often rolled out in Central Asia first. And Central Asia is a core point connecting China with the wider region. And then finally, of course, when it comes to China's alternatives, the world order, when it comes to thinking about, first of all, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a multilateral fora, China's real first multilateral framework outside of traditional Western frameworks, was rolled out in Central Asia first, which is the theme that we keep talking about here. So that's crucial. Now, this picture, the book itself, draws from a lot of field work. I spent over 4 months traveling by land across the region, conducting hundreds of hours worth of interviews. And I mean, as you can see from this picture, this is up in northern Tajikistan, the Pamir Mountains. This is kind of an example of China's emergence as a security actor in the region, not just an economic or political actor. This is the reconnaissance facility that monitors the Wakhan corridor, which is the thin border connecting China with Afghanistan. This is on the Pamir side in Tajikistan. And that's run by another multilateral forum that China has rolled out in the region called the Quadrilateral Coordination and Cooperation Mechanism. It's a combined border security force with Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and China who coordinate their efforts. So I just wanted to highlight that here as just an example of, this is a unique element in China's foreign policy. China only has three or four, depending on which sources you rely on, strategic facilities around the world. So this is one of them. And so I think that that's very important that emerged here in Central Asia. If we could go to the next slide, Ed. And this is a point that we'll talk about as Ed unpacks some of our unique data sets that we introduced in our book. But we really see 2014 as a major turning point in China's engagement with the region. This is when it really starts to expand across the board as a major security actor, both in terms of its arms supplies to the region, training exercises, its security footprint, the type of statements and cooperation it's making with the region. And of course, this comes from the wider geopolitical turmoil of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, or the prospects and planning for this withdrawal, and also fears of the conflict in Syria and the potential for Uyghur militants to return, establish base in Central Asia. That's a fear that keeps cropping up in China's engagement with the region and really drives forward a lot of the growing security cooperation. Now to the backlash itself. So of course, we're focusing on interviewing local activists, local workers, wider community at large to kind of understand why there are patterns of unrest and pushback. This is a map that we built. So this was really the first project we pursued, the mapping protest activities, not just anti-China, but of course climate protests, human rights, the broad spectrum of issues that mobilize Central Asians onto the streets. And this is the anti-China protests. This was the interest for us is not only are there increasing critiques of China, we see this in public polling data in recent years, where there are negative perceptions of China, but we also see more people mobilizing and going out onto the streets, despite the grave risks that anti-China activism often has in Central Asia. It's a highly sensitive issue. It's China being a key security partner, but also the dominant economic actor in the region. So there are a lot of interest, vested interest, particularly from elites, in cooperation with China for economic investment, for security. And so protesting China often triggers severe government penalties, arrests, and we've actually ran some regression analysis that show that of all the protest categories, protest against China is actually the most likely to result in use of force by Central Asian governments, which I think is very interesting. And of course, here we are with just a brief snapshot of public opinion polling from Central Asia Barometer, which has showed interesting trends since 2017 toward more growing negative perceptions of Central Asia. Particularly in Uzbekistan, we've seen a stark shift in public opinion. But from what we've mapped, when we look at people being mobilized, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan account for real opposition on the ground. But what's important to note is that in recent years, there's also been a lot more digital activism, use of social media apps and alternative communication platforms to share and disseminate critical information, critical viewpoints on China. So although it might not mobilize people yet onto the streets, there is a lot of very heated conversations taking place on Central Asian media platforms. These are kind of a breakdown just of themes that we found for protests, things that motivate people in opposition to Chinese projects. Of course, human rights, as I've mentioned, Xinjiang shares a large Kyrgyz and Kazakh minority population. The detention of those and the re-education centers as part of the crackdown on Xinjiang has had political repercussions across the border, where there's a lot of pressure from locals whose family members across the border have been detained for their governments to intervene and try and release some of those family members. Land issues. Land is a very sensitive issue in Central Asia. It's a common theme that crops up that this is a very vast, sparsely populated region. China is has a huge population, and there's growing concern of this asymmetric imbalance, and there's constant fear that China wants to seize more land. Labor disputes, of course, some of the labor conditions, particularly in the mining sector, are quite negative. Mistreatment of workers is quite rampant. Wage arrear problems. This motivates a lot of labor activism. There are often disputes and strikes on Chinese projects. And that's something that crops up a lot, as well as interlinked with that is environmental concerns. A lot of the mining projects are very loosely operated. They follow no real environmental standards. This often damages local water supplies, ecology, uh, pasture land for grazing livestock. These are constant sources of tension with local communities where Chinese projects are taking shape. Sovereignty concerns, of course, and corruption. We've had a lot of controversial incidents, a very notorious one being in Bishkek with the power plant and Chinese investment linked to corruption schemes. This, of course, fuels a lot of public skepticism, a lot of rightful critique of some of these Chinese projects, the lack of transparency around them, and the motivations of elites. And this empowers a whole range of actors with different motivations. Many of them see elites as selling out their country, damaging their land in exchange for building relations with China to benefit themselves. So this sort of populist messaging is becoming increasingly popular in the region. And elites are aware of it, and they're really struggling to balance against it. And of course, cultural issues. There's a lot of this populist sentiment, the growing nationalism in the region. In recent years, has come with movements. There have been kind of protests about obsessing with this issue of, or the perceived issue of Chinese men coming to marry local women, for example. That's how it's framed by ultranationalist figures. And that drives a lot of protest and opposition. There have been a lot of talks of China interfering in the cultural life of the region. And so I think, especially with religion as well, so that's another kind of flashpoint that we can talk about more in the conversation. And finally, this is some of the data. So we tracked 106 China-related protests over the time period that we were collecting data sets. We complement this with a lot more recent interviews and other sources of information following online campaigns. And a large number of these, as we point out, were related to the situation in Xinjiang, but of course, not only. And yeah, as we see there's a data point that 21% of all arrests in Kazakhstan, 21 occurred during anti-China protests. So it shows that that's a very sensitive issue in particular. Next slide, please. And this is just a final interesting point as we look to, of course, conversations about critical minerals and China's dominance of that sector globally. We show in Central Asia that there's more nuance to the picture, that China's actually in quite a vulnerable position because a lot of these projects trigger domestic opposition and unrest. And when we look and compare Chinese mining projects in the region with other foreign and international actors, we see that the Chinese ones overwhelmingly attract a lot more protest activity than those run by other actors, which kind of suggests some of our points that the Chinese projects may be not held to the same standards or maybe worse environmental conditions. And a lot of these themes that we discuss are kind of exacerbated. And I think that mining sector in particular has become a major flashpoint.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let's move to moderated discussion now. There's so much to touch upon. So sentiments regarding China differ between political business elites and your average citizen, something referred to as warm politics, cold publics. And the reasons for this divide are pretty clear, and you've touched upon them in your presentations. I'm wondering, one could even say that part of the anti-Chinese sentiment is directed towards the local elites themselves, insofar as the publics feel that they're ready to sell off resources for personal profit. So what I'm wondering is if you see regional governments making any effort to bridge this gap.
I think,
yeah, either of you, please step in.
Sure. No, well, thanks for hosting us today. Yeah, I think certainly, as Bradley alluded to, the Central Asian governments are, of course, concerned around some of the anti-Chinese sentiments and the implications that that can have for their own domestic political agendas. We obviously saw very famously the Chinese funded renovation of the Bishkek hot water plant that, of course, broke down at the height of winter and plunged the entire city that's obviously reliant on it for both heat and hot water. In the dead of winter, it was all plunged into the cold, and people were suffering as a result of what had ended up being a Chinese funded project that had cut various corners. So there was a lot of corruption, and that led to a scandal in which various members of the cabinet, including former Kyrgyz prime minister, ended up in jail. So I think that was one example of a response. Another example from Kyrgyzstan is the Atbashi logistics terminal. This was a $270 million logistics terminal near the border between China and Kyrgyzstan that was cancelled after protests. I think interestingly there, Japarov having come into power in late 2020, early 2021, he then slowly and quietly reinitiated that project. So that kind of points to how there's this kind of symbolic response, followed by a more substantive kind of gradual move towards actually implementing these projects. But certainly, you have various cases where the leadership in Central Asia is keenly aware of the need to placate the local population.
Right, thank you. I just want to go now towards the anti-Chinese sentiments themselves. One slide that you showed highlighted Central Asia Barometer data that showed a significant deterioration in perceptions of China from 2017 onwards. But by the same token, as you note in your book, anti-Chinese sentiments in Central Asia actually peaked in 2020. And they showed a slight improvement over the next 4 years. And this is most likely owing to negative reaction to Russia's war against Ukraine and Chinese efforts to improve its image. So essentially, by 2024, you have over half of survey respondents in all Central Asian states, with the exception of Uzbekistan, holding a favorable opinion about China. Now, this is according to the same Central Asia Barometer data. So overall, this would indicate that there's a more positive sentiment in the region towards China than negative sentiment. So would you agree with this? And basically, why is Uzbekistan the outlier?
Um, no, I think this is very interesting data, and I think our protest data, we had the graphic of the number of anti-China protests that peaked around 2019, 2020. Obviously, in the case of Kazakhstan, 2019 was the transition of power, and China was kind of wrapped up with a whole bunch of other concerns by opposition activists around the transition from Nazarbayev to Tokayev, and in Kyrgyzstan, we had the revolution of 2020 that also created a wave of anti-China protests as they capitalized on that situation we saw in October 2020, where there were three individuals claiming to be the legitimate leader of the country, and within that power vacuum, we saw this kind of Sinophobia bubbling up. So, coupled with that 2020, of course, COVID, many people blamed China for COVID. And so, yeah, we really saw a kind of peak in anti-Chinese sentiments. I think another important part of the story, and we focus on this on the latter two chapters of the book, is the way in which China has adapted its approach, right? China is aware that it has an image problem in the region. Many people are not many people are xenophobic. They're also sino-agonistic. They don't know much about China, and so China's been putting in a lot of efforts into trying to improve its image in the region. Some of these efforts have certainly fallen flat. Bradley can talk about his visits to the Confucius Institutes in Uzbekistan and how limited local buy-in they have and limited local interest they have. But I think more recently there have been moves towards localizing labor, towards introducing initiatives like the Luban workshops, which are these technical workshops that have been introduced in the region since 2016 that provide kind of job skill training that focus on issues like mining and hydrology and hydrology, that actually provide kind of skills training. The move towards away from extraction or towards investments that are in production and higher end technological investments, all of these combined are also helping China to improve its image.
I do think, just to add to that, that is a key point, is that many people have strong, favorable views of China. Many have very negative views, but the overwhelming majority actually don't have strong views on China. What I encounter when I visit the region, I speak and interview people, is that the vast majority just don't have an opinion of China. They have much stronger opinions of actors they're more familiar with, including the United States, but also in particular Russia. They have far more deeper cultural engagement. And so they understand Russia, they know issues they have with Russia. But when it comes to China, it's something of a blank slate. And I think that that's an important point of the book that we unpack, is that despite China's overwhelming presence economically in the region, that's translated into very little cultural pool. And that's a real weakness of China, not just in Central Asia, but in other parts of the world where we've seen that it doesn't have the type of cultural engagement that we would expect for an actor of its size and its political position on the world stage. And I think that that does have wider implications as well, that it's something of an information vacuum that, as Ed has pointed out, with these various flashpoints and incidents that happen in the region, whether it's COVID or some of the political transition tensions that have taken place, it's very easier to position China as kind of the boogeyman in these scenarios, because so little is known about it, that it does make it kind of a victim often of sometimes conspiracy theories as well as legitimate criticisms. And so I think that without soft power, China leaves itself quite exposed and vulnerable.
Yes, I just wanted to flag that while less than 50% expressed negative sentiment towards China, this doesn't necessarily mean that that other over 50% holds positive sentiment. It could be rather just neutral. But this leads to another really interesting question. In terms of these popular attitudes, how would you say China compares with other major powers, such as Russia, Turkey in particular, the Gulf states, the EU, the US?
We have some
either of you.
comparative data, and in the introduction of the book, we make it clear that we're not saying that China is the only unpopular actor. We're not saying, as if we've already said, that China is unpopular for everyone, that everyone is Sinophobic. We're not saying that China is viewed more favorably than the United States, because the polling data would point to the United States also there being lots of anti-American views in the region. I think, as you've already mentioned, the shift in recent years, particularly in Kazakhstan, which of course shares a very long border with Russia, to a lesser degree in Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan has been, and we don't really have accurate data from Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, has been towards increasing anti-Russian sentiments, particularly amongst the younger population. And we took the Central Asian Barometer data and broke it out by age, and certainly there's a big divide, particularly in Kazakhstan, between the younger generation that's more anti-Russian or holds more negative sentiments towards Russia, and the older generation, of course, the generation that came of age in the Soviet Union, that has more positive views towards Russia. I think, as you mentioned, Turkey has been a country that's capitalized on the desire of the countries to develop ties with other power centers, and perceptions of Turkey have improved. And I think now the polling data that we have points to Turkey being the most popular foreign actor. Of course, the Gulf states also have a great degree of influence as societies re-embrace Islam. Of course, the governments themselves are interested in generating investments from the Gulf states that have become major investments, particularly in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. But ultimately, of course, they're also a little concerned around and want to ensure that economic investment doesn't come with too much cultural, religious influence. So, it's a mixed picture.
Very interesting about Turkey. I'd like to cast my net a bit wider now and move on to China's relationship with Russia and how this manifests itself in Central Asia. Russia's economic power in Central Asia has been declining, and China's has been rising since Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So do you think it's fair to say that this development has not translated into increased strategic competition in the region? In other words, do you think that Moscow and Beijing are seeking to deconflict there? I mean, do you see any tensions around China's increasing securitization in Tajikistan, for example? This is a question that comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an important question. It's one we get in DC all the time about whether Central Asia is some sort of strategic wedge for which Chinese-Russian relations break down. And our data, our years of analysis show that not really, because they have a convergence of interests in the region. Both actors want this region to be stable. Of course, they have security issues in the region, the constant specter of extremism, conflict spillover from Afghanistan into Russia and into China. So neither actor wants to see instability in the region. A lot of this infrastructure that we see, increasingly that has changed, because some of course, with efforts to isolate Russia, some of this new infrastructure may lead to the region becoming less economically connected to Russia in the long run. But for the short term, there's been some convergence generally. In terms of security, we have seen some interesting discussions taking place as China moves deeper into the security sphere. We've seen this with the 2016, when this facility that I showed the photograph of in Tajikistan, the reconnaissance facility, China was very careful to bring key Russian policymakers to Beijing to float that idea before they moved. They started establishing the security presence there. There were concerns about how Russia would react. And China very deliberately made sure not to station the PLA there, because that would have been seen as too provocative. The base is more connected with the paramilitary wing of the Chinese Communist Party, which is more closely aligned with Central Asian National Guard units. So that was very important, and that was seen widely as something of a concession so as not to antagonize Russia. And that was in 2016. But we have seen in recent years that while China used to historically work through multilateral frameworks like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Russia was a key member, China is now increasingly engaging with the region bilaterally as well. So in terms of its security, it's still not disrupted Russia, but it's definitely acting more autonomously. And just a final point, we've looked at arms data in the region, and that while China has grown exponentially, we have slides that we can share as an arms supplier to the region. It hasn't actually displaced Russia. When we look at, although Russia's arms market has shrunk somewhat, it's actually China's market share has been eating into those of NATO allies. So in a way, although China is becoming a bigger security actor in the region, so far it hasn't been a competitor with Russia. It's actually been pushing out countries with which Russia would also like to see have less presence in Central Asia. And so I think the data is quite interesting when you scrutinize it more.
Yeah, but other than security, do you see any significant weak spots within Sino-Russian cooperation in Central Asia where they really might rub each other the wrong way? Or only security?
I think over time, obviously, I think there's the question of, well, what can Russia do about this, right? I mean, Russia was overtaken as the main kind of external trade partner for the region by China in 2008. China's now the largest investor, the largest creditor in the region. China's political influence has been growing. China's introduced, as Bradley said, various kind of its own bilateral and multilateral initiatives, the China plus Central Asia Forum, the QCCM. It's increasingly operating bilaterally, organizing military exercises. And so I think we have some evidence from conversations that we've had that certainly people in Moscow perhaps aren't happy about that, right? They're not happy about China encroaching into what they consider to be their near abroad or their sphere of influence. But, Russia has limited bargaining power vis-a-vis China. We know that's an asymmetrical relationship in and of itself. And so, although the concerns may exist, Russia, can't do particularly much about them.
Yes, and yet, contrary to conventional wisdom, China's ascendancy in Central Asia has not led to the weakening of the region's ties with Russia. The Central Asian states themselves understand the imperative of maintaining strong relations with both powers. Do you think there are ways that China acts as a hedge on Russia's more aggressive ambitions?
I think certainly it does, right? And we saw that very pointed at Xi Jinping's first trip outside of China after COVID was to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. which was in the fall of 2022, the autumn of 2022, right? He made these very pointed statements about supporting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of those countries, right? And that was, that was viewed by many as being a thinly veiled kind of support for their sovereignty in the wake of what Russia was doing to Ukraine and other neighbors. And so I think, it is a useful foil. It's useful for the Central Asian republics. I think another thing that we obviously talk about a lot in the book is, the desire for multi-vector diplomacy, right? Each of these countries, they want to be friends with Russia, the United States, the EU, China, Iran, the Gulf states, all simultaneously, right? And so they don't want to become overly dependent on Russia or China as the main principal external actors, but they can, of course, they can use both of those external powers to kind of balance off and try and create as much strategic autonomy as they can for themselves. Of course, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are the best place to do this as the largest and richest countries in the region. The other countries are a little less able to do so, but certainly what they want to do is to avoid dependence, and China's rise, particularly in the security sector, has been useful in this regard.
Yeah, I think that shows a.
Okay, go ahead, Bradley. Sure.
I was just going to say, I think it shows an interesting trend with global geopolitics as well. Is that Central Asia, what we saw is just emergent multipolarity. That these countries are trying to balance the relationships, not just with Russia, China, so the US as well. When actors such as the US attempt to kind of make them choose one camp or the other, that's create tensions in relationships. When the US under the first Trump admin tried to get Central Asia to take a hard stance on the Xinjiang issue, pit them against China, that just led to a lot of discomfort. It's similar with the Biden administration with getting the governments to take a hard stance on sanctions evasion with Russia. The regions, while they can overlap relations, they can work with China, with Russia, with the United States. There's a lot more actors kind of increasingly involved, especially from the Gulf, Turkey, as you've mentioned. And so I think that the complex negotiations that take place, that this is a region that didn't fall into either the Russia or Chinese camp. It's actually successfully positioning itself for relationships with multiple actors. And I think that tells us a bigger picture about emergent multipolarity on the global stage as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems that after a long drop in U.S. attention to Central Asia, Trump 2.0 is currently bringing the region back into its focus, in large part because of convergent interests in connectivity and critical minerals. And so we saw last month, for the first time in history, we watched the U.S. president gather in Washington with the presidents of all 5 Central Asian states. And, Central Asian governments are naturally keen to utilize the symbolic capital that is the byproduct of interest in the region, as you pointed out. So, and you've also put it certainly easier for them to interact with the Trump administration. And so insofar as they're not required to take a particular stance on human rights. And yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the case with Secretary of State Pompeo when he visited the region during Trump 1.0 and demanded that the Central Asian leaderships take a position on Xinjiang. And this only shows how far things have changed on the ground in terms of the U.S. approach. So if Russia and China take Washington much more seriously than they do Brussels, so this U.S. attention really helps give Central Asia strategic flexibility. But do you think that only Washington can serve as a sufficient counterweight to both Moscow and Beijing? And so without U.S. involvement, Central Asia's longstanding multi-vector policy becomes meaningless. Would you say that's correct, or would you somehow modify that?
I would say, there are, as we've mentioned, there are various other kind of smaller actors, middle powers, we could say, regional powers that are playing a key role. We've mentioned Turkey, the Gulf states, Japan, and Korea. There are various, and the European Union, which increasingly is acting as a collective actor in Central Asia. We, earlier this year saw the first meeting between the EU leaders and the Central Asian presidents, right? And so, I think increased US interest, of course, is useful. It's useful, as you say, that Trump isn't interested in human rights. He's interested in that he's a strong man, right? And seems to respond well to other strong people, or self-styled strong people. And, he's wanting to do deals that in spheres like critical minerals, transport, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, that can benefit the regimes. So, I think there are various other actors that are already playing a counterbalance. I think increased US interest, of course, is good for the region, or good from a regional perspective. Basically, they want to be courted by multiple actors, and so to the extent to which they can all come to Washington and have their big meeting at the White House, that's good for their prestige, good for their egos, really.
Yeah, this brings us on to the question of how likely it is that we'll see any tangible results on the ground. I mean, Kazakhstan is the world's top uranium producer, holds nearly 3 million tons of rare earth elements, and a recently identified major deposit could possibly vault its position to third place globally, behind only China and Brazil. So, but yet, despite all of that, chances are high that the U.S. Central Asian relations will remain at the level of empty promises. And I see three main reasons behind this, and I'm wondering whether you agree. The first is that the U.S. has long expressed interest in developing critical minerals for Central Asia, yet concrete steps have been limited. And the Central Asian states don't really want another extractive power entering the scene to buy up natural resources and process them abroad. This is what China does, and then sells these materials at a much higher margin. Central Asians want technology, domestic processing capacity, and market access. But this sort of integrated strategy is harder for the US to achieve than for Chinese and Russian state companies. And we've seen this over and over. The second reason is simply that Central Asia's limited infrastructure constrains trade with the US, and even bearing in mind the development of the Middle Corridor. And lastly, of course, there is potential pushback from Russia and China, especially if cooperation involves something like dual use technologies or geospatial surveying. So what are your views on the prospects for success? Which of you wants to step in?
I mean, I can go first. Yeah, I think when you looked at the deals that were cut, obviously we had both the meetings in the UN General Assembly and then more recently, of course, the summit at the White House last month. A lot of them are kind of, there for things like planes, trains, they're for different platforms. And so, a few of them were kind of longer term deals on extraction, but most of them are kind of just shorter term. I think, of course, the United States will always struggle for influence insofar as, when dealing with China and when dealing with Russia, of course, authoritarian states with leaders who've been in power for over a decade or 2 decades, of course, in the case of Putin, we don't know what's going to happen with the next election in the United States. If we see a new administration come in from the Democrat side, then we are going to see we're going to see some shift in the policy towards Central Asia. And so, I think there's there's that concern. There's the concern, as you say, around the United States businesses, lacking strong connections in the region, lacking the kind of the intermediaries and connections that Chinese and Russian businesses have developed. And so, I think for that reason, they'll find it challenging, coupled with the difficult investment climates in many of these countries, high levels of corruption. And so, I think this meeting, although it was very symbolic, I don't know to what extent it's really a sea change in relations between the United States and Russia, United States and Central Asia. The United States is not going to step in and play the kind of role that Russia or China does in the region.
Yeah, I think we'll have to meet in a year or 2 or 3 and see what comes up of it. I mean, we've sort of been here before, but let's see. I'd like to take some questions from the audience now. We have a number of very good ones, and I'll just give you 2 at the same time. And one of our viewers is wondering, Russia is still the most influential country in the region as a whole, diplomatically and strategically, and certainly, as you mentioned, in terms of soft power, despite the war in Ukraine. And do you see any protests against Russia in Central Asia, which we might compare protests against China? And you two are perfectly placed to answer this, given your wonderful protest tracker that the 2 of you actually invented, and which we've all been very grateful for. Sure. And another question, just to go on the back of that, is the EU an actor that plays a role in Central Asia next to China, US, and Russia? Is the EU's influence growing in the region after 2022?
I think on the former question, we have seen protests against Russia. Our Central Asia protest tracker only collects data till 2021. We kept that data running on China specifically for this book. But I know looking at news stories, there have been various protests by activists in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and other, particularly those two countries in the region, against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right? We haven't seen quite the same number of protests against Russian companies in the region. We haven't really tracked that. But yeah, we certainly have seen protests against Russia. But in our historical data from 2018 to 2021, we found that 70% of protests targeting foreign actors, be they governments or companies, were targeting China. So for that period, certainly we know that China was the main target of protests. The EU, I don't know if Bradley wants to tackle, but I think the EU, of course, has increased its engagement with the region, has a new strategy. It's launched, obviously, its competitor to the VRI on a smaller scale, Global Gateway. It's obviously looking to engage with the region, I think, as we've seen the Trump administration dismantling US aid and cutting various programs in the region. Of course, the EU is trying to step in and take a greater role in media development, civil society, et cetera, et cetera. But, it certainly is less important and can't really rival the roles of Russia and China.
Now, just add to the Russia question, that it's simply a more holistic actor in the region than China at present, in terms of its cultural influence from Russian language to its media programming and engagement in the region, but also the fact that millions of Central Asian labor migrants go to Russia to work. There is nothing of that scale with interactions, people-to-people contact between Central Asians and China. In fact, China is becoming a more difficult environment to get work permits for. So I think that there's just far less engagement. And then in terms of things like education, Russia vastly outnumbers the number of programs, grants, university positions. Although China is growing in that area, it still lags significantly. And so this comes again with the shortage of soft power initiatives with China, that it hasn't really sought on a cultural level to displace Russia. Although Russia has been declining, it's still very, very much the dominant cultural actor in the region.
Yeah. So you stopped your protest tracker in 2021, before the full-scale invasion. So that's interesting. So you don't actually have data on any possible protests in Central Asia towards Russia. Is that correct then?
That's correct. But now you're inspiring us. We should do a kind of protests against foreign actors in Central Asia. That might be the way to try and maintain the protest tracker. Exactly.
Yeah, the way forward. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the EU, I'm curious, given Global Gateway and the EU's pledge of 12 billion euros, but yet I personally haven't seen anything very concrete. Do we really even know anything about how this money is to be allocated? Is this just at the level of a memorandum? Do you know anything more about this?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few different pledged deals that have been signed. I haven't tracked whether those are actually being implemented. Of course, the scale, we're talking about is much less than the money being invested by Chinese companies through Belt and Road Initiative, of course. But of course, the EU is trying to position itself as a more competitive actor, providing more value added, providing maintenance of the environment, anti-corruption, and so on and so forth, that should make it a more attractive investor and should dampen the kind of levels of backlash that we've seen against actors like China. But I think it's an initiative that was intended to position the EU as a competitor with China, but I don't think, as we said, that the EU is in a position to compete, really within the region if we're honest.
Yeah, which leads us back to the US. But however, I'm going to go to another question that pertains to something rather at the beginning of your presentation, when you mentioned the quadrilateral mechanism of cooperation that consists of China, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And this viewer would like to know if this mechanism is still viable after after the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan? We haven't yet mentioned Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Of course, it's still active, but there were transition issues when the Afghan government fell and was replaced with the Taliban. There were reports from our colleagues at Radio Free Europe that some of the initial employees when the QCACM were actually stranded out there in Tajikistan with no support. It's actually a great question because I'm not sure the follow-up after that, as tends to be the case with media, and especially in Central Asia, where it's becoming increasingly difficult to access information with recent crackdowns on media reporting on anything to do with China. We were discussing before this presentation just Central Asia Barometer. The polling of anti-China sentiments in Tajikistan led to the arrest of one of the pollsters who was accused of espionage. So getting information has just been extremely difficult. I think there is viability for cooperation, of course, but as we're seeing, and as I'm sure Ed can add more, the recent attack on Chinese mine workers on the Tajik border shows some of the limits of the QCCM, where this attack occurred using drone technology, quite limited crude drones that killed five Chinese workers. So there's clear tensions on the border and an inability to protect the workers there. Ed, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, obviously you have Pakistan that's been engaging in frequent firefights with the Taliban over the border. We have Tajikistan that's obviously historically been supportive of the opposition, Shah Ahmed Massoud, his son. That Rahman, after the Taliban takeover in 2021, President Rahman was very critical, calling on the Taliban to be more inclusive of the country's very large Tajik minority, about a third of the country's population. And so those tensions, of course, are making the QCCM, a relatively ineffective operator. But I think these recent attacks, we saw both in the space of a week an attack on it and the death of a Chinese citizen. Two Chinese citizens in Tajikistan, and then another attack across on the Afghan side of the border where more Chinese workers were killed. Of course, Afghanistan has played prominently into China's view of the region. It views, like Russia, the region as vulnerable to armed incursions coming and violence spilling over from Afghanistan. And so, we'll have to see what China's response to this is. But certainly one thing we may see, and we have seen that we discuss in the book, is, China bringing in more private security companies, for example, and finding ways to engage with more security assistance. And these are the kind of things we can expect China to do if it doesn't think that the Tajik side can protect its interests.
Mm. Yeah, we have a really interesting question here about AI, and we know that there is some pushback in the region against Chinese surveillance. But this question is about the collection, use, and management of data for AI in the region. And this viewer is asking, how do you see the perception of Central Asian actors on these matters? Do they feel any impact or direct role of China in data collection and use in the region?
Yeah, there have been a lot of tensions on this topic about data collection. You see a lot of China's been investing in a lot of smart city infrastructure, for example, in Central Asia, where we've seen a lot of the traffic cameras or Chinese companies for automatic ticket violations, that sort of thing, speeding tickets. A lot of that attracted scrutiny. There were a lot of memes and stuff that were circulating on Central Asian social media, kind of mocking the idea of a Chinese big brother watching Central Asians collecting their data. A lot of these agreements on smart city programs and on technology cooperation agreements with China, there's often just a lack of transparency about data storage. In particular, China will bring some of the infrastructure at discounted rates, and in exchange, sometimes the data is stored in China. An exchange as part of that agreement. So sometimes Central Asian governments or local mayors, that sort of at the lower levels of government, may approve certain deals. And that's kind of the trade-off, is that there's less control over data. And I think that is a point of tension, definitely. Central Asians talk about it a lot. There are a lot of concerns. Even some of these experimental projects that have been rolled out, such as in Astana, where we had you could pay for the bus automatically using a scan of your face for access to the bus. That sort of thing just attracted a lot of scrutiny and concern. And so I think that although China is making huge inroads as a technology actor, I expect a lot of these debates are only going to be more intensified with conversations on AI in particular, much like they are elsewhere.
Yeah, it seems that tensions are set to grow in this regard. Moving now towards Central Asian cooperation, I have one question here. This is that the Central Asian states increasingly show a united front when engaging with the world, and we've certainly seen this with all of the C+1 formats. Now, some may argue that for Russia, it has always been easier to engage with Central Asian states separately, as united regional force can pose political challenges to the Kremlin. But what about China? In other words, does China prefer to relate to these states individually or as a unit? What is your impression there?
Well, I think China is similar, right? We obviously have seen the various China plus Central Asia summits. There was one in Xi'an earlier this year, and we see the meeting between all of them, but then most of the important developments, most of the important agreements happen in the bilateral meetings. I think China has engaged with the region multilaterally, but still primarily in a substantive form through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think like Russia, of course, it favors the multilateral initiatives, of course, look important, right? And they're important symbolically to show China's kind of engaging with the region as a region. But ultimately, it's the bilateral meetings are more important. And certainly, something we point to in the book is this rising regionalism, right? These consultative meetings that took place last month with the addition of now Azerbaijan into the now become the C6. The way in which regional trade has increased, particularly since 2016 with the death of Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan. And so, this kind of creates a kind of dynamic of balancing regionalism, right, where the region certainly has the potential to coordinate to increase its strategic autonomy by balancing against some of these external powers. We haven't really seen that happening in any substantive way, but the potential's certainly there.
Yeah, this is precisely the question posed by another viewer who says, what are your views on the recent inclusion of Azerbaijan to the Consultative Central Asian Heads of State Summit, making it C6? Now, do you think this is symbolic or rather a meaningful conclusion given the development of connectivity?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting. I mean, the last couple of visits I've had to the region, Azerbaijan's definitely cropping up a lot more in conversations because of that connectivity piece. I think optically it's interesting, it's very important. But at the moment, Azerbaijan's trade with the region remains extremely limited. Its engagement overall, materially speaking, is extremely limited. And as the Central Asian states view it as a Central Asian actor, not really. They're still it's still very early stages. But what I think is interesting is that now, as Azerbaijan's positioning itself as the center of this Eurasian connectivity, it might bring new momentum to a lot of these conversations. That's kind of much needed ultimately. And I think Azerbaijan could position itself in the future as an interesting linkage. And so I'm particularly interested in that conversation.
Yeah, it seems so, because not only is Azerbaijan a key link in the middle corridor, it's also a key link in the north-south transportation route used by Russia. So it'll be interesting to see how China responds to this development in time. I'm going to ask you another question here from a viewer on the United States' new national security strategy, which does not mention Central Asia and Afghanistan at all, even regarding cooperation on critical minerals. Now, this viewer asks if, whereas it says it's supposed to be a prospective sphere for interaction between the U.S. and Central Asia, as declared during the C5+1 summit in Washington, which we alluded to before. But the document prioritizes only Africa. So what are your thoughts on this? Does this mean that Trump was just, having a day with the 5 presidents and now it's gone? Or what do you think of that?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, yes, that Africa was singled out, right? And Africa as a kind of zone of foreign influence, Africa as a source of critical minerals, and Central Asia was largely absent. We obviously know that the process of writing that NSS was perhaps somewhat chaotic. We're in the process of they're also in the process of developing a new strategy towards the region, and so that might create a more substantive formulation of US policy towards the region. It's been communicated to me as being critical minerals, great power competition, curbing illegal migration, and counterterrorism as being the kind of 4 key pillars of US strategy towards the region. We'll see if that kind of becomes the formal strategy, but certainly it was notable for its absence. Although the administration, when you meet with them, of course, repeatedly told me and others that Central Asia is a priority, but obviously we've not seen it coming to the fore in the recent national security strategy. So, yeah,
that's very interesting. That's a very, very curious point. Well, thank you. I'm going to have to wrap up here. And so apologies to those who've asked questions that we won't be able to get to, but I hope you all agree. It's been a really lively and interesting discussion. And my thanks, of course, go to Ed and Bradley for your time and contributions, and to our audiences for your questions, and also to Eliza and Zulaitite and Anna Morgan from the Russia and Eurasia program here at Chatham House. Don't want to forget them. And a final reminder that the session has been recorded, so you can catch up on Chatham House's YouTube channel if you've missed anything. So sincere thanks again to our panelists and audience, and until we meet again.